Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 8.5, Culture After 1945. Our learning objective today is 8F. Explain how mass culture has been maintained or challenged over time. Our single key idea today says mass culture became increasingly homogeneous in the post-war years, inspiring challenges to conformity by artists, intellectuals, and rebellious youth. Now, when we think about the 1950s, mass culture is oftentimes defined by music. And music in the 1950s changed. We see doo-wop music dominating the early 1950s, especially out of Motown. But it's soon challenged by the popularity of rock and roll, especially people like Elvis Presley is incredibly popular among youths, though he was inspired by African-American artists. There's a couple pictures of Elvis Presley and his fandom right there. Now, many people didn't like Elvis during this particular time. Rock scared parents. They thought the fast beats were immoral. And yes, he did say that rock and roll music was a sin. Now, teenagers during this time were an incredibly important force in the 1950s. Suburban teens had leisure time. They had money to spend. And they did many things during the 1950s. Dances, hanging out in cars, listening to Chubby Checker talk about doing the twist, and businesses targeted them. They tried to sell billions of dollars of cool consumer goods. Now, Hollywood also targeted teens. They made films about juvenile delinquency, such as James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, and The Cool and the Crazy. But generally speaking, for the most part, TVs, movies, and especially advertising in the 1950s promoted conformity and stereotypes. Generally speaking, the ideal man was the provider and the boss of the house. We see that, for instance, in Father Knows Best, a popular TV show during the 1950s. And generally speaking, the ideal housewife was, the ideal woman was a housewife and a mother. We see in the various TV and print ads during the 1950s. Even some of the more shocking advertisements from the 1950s, you can notice them here. The idea of what should a woman or a wife do. Now, even though the media promoted women as mothers and homemakers, most actually had jobs. 40% of women worked during this time. But generally speaking, this conformity were these kind of basic behavioral rules. Obey authority, control your emotions, fit in with the crowd, don't even think about sex. But for the most part, what we do see is that these stereotypes are not actually accurate of most Americans. In fact, the sexologist Alfred Kinsey revealed that premarital sex and extramarital affairs were actually fairly common during the 1950s. And people like Hugh Hefner made his first publication of Playboy in 1953. Now, the reaction against this attempt at conformity we see not only with teenagers but also with artists as well. Right? For instance, the Beat movement rejected conformity. And what were called the beatniks were mostly artists and writers, and they lived these non-conformist lives. They rejected suburbs, consumerism, quote-unquote regular jobs. Jack Kerouac was probably the most famous, and with his book On the Road, and this will later inspire the hippies of the 1960s. So generally speaking, fairly short lecture today, but generally speaking, here's what we got to understand. All right, media especially and mass culture promoted conformity. This idea that we should all be the same, we should all listen to the same music, we should act in a certain way. Television shows especially promoted this conformity. However, we see not only artists and intellectuals through the beatniks, but also youth as well really kind of strike out against this and really kind of want to go their own way. Now, they're going to become much more rebellious in the 1960s as we get to the hippie and the counterculture movement, but we'll talk about that in another lecture. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, and as always, go Pack.